We resume our panel, Social Movements from and About Asianness in Latin America, which was part of the 2023 Southwest Conference on Asian Studies annual meeting. Now I will introduce Maria Alexandra Arana Blas. Alexandra is an MA and PhD student in Hispanic languages and literatures at the University of Pittsburgh and serves as the director of the Peruvian LGBTIQA+ magazine Crónicas de la Diversidad. Her undergraduate research in the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú won the Academic Research Award in 2012 and the Padet Award for bachelor thesis in 2016. Her research revolves around gender, sexuality, and LGBTIQA+ cultures, youth culture, pop culture, girl culture, and fan culture, and Trans-Pacific studies. She published in digital and print media since 2015, and in 2022, she published the book En el Jardín de Lirios, El amor entre mujeres en la cultura pop asiática. The title of her presentation is Otaku Community and Activism, the Case of Artivists and the Peruvian Otaku Front. Please go ahead, Alexandra.
Thank you, Andrea, very much for your presentation, for presenting me, I mean. And now I'm going to start with the presentation here. So here we are. Today's presentation is called the Otaku Community and Activism, the Case of Artivists and the Otaku Peruvian Front. First of all, I want to say that this study, for this study, I have to recognize myself first as an otaku, a fanatic or a fan of anime and manga, and that's why I have so many hope in this type of products, even though they come from a capitalist context that insert us consumers into these dynamics of capital. And yeah, and even though that I have a big hope in these products and how they can help me and us to have some type of political action. Also, I have to recognize myself as a Chinese Peruvian or Tucson. So that's why this type of products, even though I find in them a kind of tool that can help us to see the empty spaces or the problems in our society. I also, in our society and in capitalism, I also see how they don't necessarily confront this very big problem that we have in all the world, but also in Latin America, Peru, and that we were talking in this panel, that it's the problem of Orientalism, or what happened with the real Asian bodies in the territory, and how these popular culture products, even though they are received by people, but by big masses of people in Latin America, even though that that doesn't help with how sometimes this fan community see the real Asian bodies in Asia. So there is a problem of orientalization there. But even though that, we have to recognize that it had and it still has a political potential. Specifically, if we think about the protests during the COVID pandemic during 2020. We had the examples of Chile, where some otakus went and protest with other population against the government, but also was the case in Peruvian society, specifically in November of 2020, when there was a president de facto, Manuel Merino, who took the power. And of course, he was not recognized by the majority of Peruvian society, and there was a big mobilization, big protest. Especially in Lima, it was big, but there was also other protests in other parts of Peru. But I'm going to center in the case of Lima. And in the case of Lima, we saw not only people who were politically active, but also we saw, and very interestingly, the participation of fan communities in general. For example, fans of football or hinchas who were in the front line together with skaters. And also there were gamers, Potterheads, and also the Otaku community. Of course, their ways of participation in these protests were kind of different, because the fans of football and the skaters were in the front line, like fighting with the police, and the other communities or fan communities that I mentioned were mainly in the second line or behind. And because of that, some of them, as the press, were very intrigued of this community, because they started to put them as a model way of protest with creativity, etc., etc. But well, that's a way of reabsorption that I'm going to talk later. But yeah, so this is the context, this is the beginning, this is the context, that in 2020 there was a fan community, the Otaku community, who participate in this protest. But it would be an injustice for the history of political activism from these groups to only say that it was since 2020, because there is a rich story behind that will help us understand why there is this intersection between political activism, fan activism, and also other type of activism that join all of them, that is the activism of some Artivists who are LGBT. So for that, we have to see some antecedents, the activism and social crisis in the Peru of the 90s. So in the 90s, it was a moment of general crisis for the nation. All the categories were put into doubt, the categories of the nation to begin it. What is to be a citizen in Peru? All the bodies are part of the nation or not? What are the categories of the body, of sexuality, etc., etc.? Also, it was a moment when most of the political activism that was very strong during the 70s and 80s were absorbed by Alberto Fujimori, the president here, the dictator during the 90s. He absorbed what is popular feminism, that was part of the feminism during the 70s and the 80s. Yeah, it emerged in these feminist groups because these feminist groups of the 70s and the 80s they began with leftist groups, but because of sexism, they decide to create other groups and create feminist groups. So in these feminist groups, even though they were from middle and high classes, they still had this action with low classes, and there was this type of dialogue. Also, from these feminist movements from the 70s and 80s, appeared the first LGBT movements the first years of the 80s. So we have to recognize that the social movements, the social movements that were feminist and LGBT had a middle class educated origin. So this type of activism, this type of political mobilization that was very strong during the 80s was absorbed by Alberto Fujimori, especially the feminist one, because at the end he was conservative and he decided to omit all the LGBT activism and politics, and was absorbed and disarticulated by Alberto Fujimori. Also, there was economic crisis, and also in these years appeared a new social actor. Not only the popular classes that were that Alberto Fujimori was supporting, but also the model minorities or the Asian descendants. So because all these things that were happening in the 90s is that there was what I was saying, a total crisis of the categories. And this was reflected in a type of literature during the 90s that was the LGBT literature. It was a boom. We have like 8 books there that were published during this decade. So during the 90s, the literature expresses the crisis in Peru, but also this type of crisis and violence was presented in other type of media, that was the fanzine. This fanzine started in the 80s and it continues in the 90s, and it was a model of, it was based on the counterculture, had many American influences, and also has this model of denounce and protest and depicts violence. Also, there was some LGBT comics, but they were from private circulation or for jokes during the 90s. But yeah, so we have this general crisis in Peru that was depicted in high literature and in what could say popular literature or low literature, depending on the terminology we want to use. But some of these people who participated in the fanzine scene during the 80s and 90s also and depicted this type of violence, they start to work in other type of production, that it's also the fanzine production, but in the community of anime and manga, or the community of the otaku community, the fans of anime and manga. They usually use this space as a form, we can say, as a form of escapism from this violence, but at the same time, they highlight the possibility of their characters to do a change in society, to change the reality, and yeah, to change reality. So what we can see in this type of narratives is a highlight on the agency of their characters and how they can change the reality and can build a kind of utopia there. So yeah, we have to know that this type of products has a lot of history, starting in the 60s in Peru. It was broadcasted in TV, in national television. So in the 90s, there was this generation who was able to produce their own narratives based and their own narratives and discourse around anime and manga. So we have not necessarily products that were originally from Japan and came from Peru, and the people consume it because it was kind of difficult. Our economy was still stabilizing. But based on this product, they create new things and new narratives in this style of anime and manga. So yeah, we also have to recognize that, okay, this type of products, even though they emerge in a neoliberal context of the 90s, they still are inserted in a context of social and political crisis, and from the 90s onwards start to reflect about this problematic in their narratives. We also have to know that one other characteristic of this type of fan community in Peru, and I would also risk to say that it's a characteristic of Latin America, is that the otaku community could be very critical around the capital. So even though it consumes products, series that are made by the animated industry, the ways of distribution and consumption can be a little illegal sometimes, because most of the times this community goes to markets and buy pirate DVDs or VHS there, or they go to internet and just see illegally the products there. So there is this creation of an alternative market around this fan community, and also there is this creation of alternative forms of distribution of fan material. So yeah, again, it's a community inserted in capital, but at the same time has some practices that escape from it and create alternative spaces. So based on all this, I have this question. Well, the next part, between mass media and activism, the emergence of Artivism and Otaku activism. So how, even though there is a consumption of capitalist products, the person doesn't lose agency. And for that, I use this concept of the multitude, rescued by these authors, Nick Dyer Whitford and Greg Depoter, in the book Games of Empire. They quote the authors Hart and Negri, who create this concept of the multitude, but discuss it and say what's their point of view of this exact concept. Here I have a quote about it, and yeah, since we have time, I'm going to read it and then to say what's my point of view of these quotes. It says, "We work with a revised and modulated version of empire. By empire, we mean the global capitalist ascendancy of the early 21st century, a system administered and policed by a consortium of competitively collaborative neoliberal states, among whom the United States still clings, by virtue of its military might, to an increasingly dubious preeminence. This is a regime of biopower based on corporate exploitation of myriad types of labor, paid and unpaid, for the continuous enrichment of a planetary plutocracy. Among these many toils, immaterial labor in information and communication systems, such as the media, is not necessarily most important, but it clearly occupies a strategic position because of its role in intellectually and affectively shaping subjectivities throughout other parts of the system. This empire is an order of extraordinary scope and depth, yet it is also precarious. It confronts a set of interlocking crises." And the second quote, "Empire is, however, a thoroughly ambivalent system. To use an old metaphor from Marx and Engels, capital is like the sorcerer's apprentice, conjuring up forces it cannot fully control. Multitudinous subjectivity is not only technically astute and culturally creative, but also potentially subversive because its skills, aptitudes, and desires exceed the uses to which empire tries to confine them. This takes us to a second manifestation of the multitude, new movements opposing global capital. Hart and Negri main theme is the way empire's subjects refuse to submit to its bottom line logic. So in other words, and what I was saying in all this presentation until now, we are inserted in a global capitalist society under the regime of biopower, and especially in 21st century, media shapes our subjectivities, but at the end, it's a precarious system, this media, I mean. Because capital cannot fully control the subject because it still has skills, aptitudes, and desire that exceed all this system. So I want to keep with this concept of the potential of the subject or the human being, and how this potential leads to an agency of the subject, an agency that could emerge in some moments of crisis, for example. One example we can see here in the 2020 and how we saw a kind of otaku activism in social media, for example. So since not only a generational thing, but it's a thing about the otaku community that was between physical spaces and virtual spaces. That's a characteristic of Otaku community, or in Latin America, in Peru, in this particular case. So because their action was, or they are very used to use social media and how to communicate in social media, they start to use the language of social media to start to make a kind of activism. For example, we have in the top right an example on how some of the journalists during the protest start to spread wrong information about the origins of the protest, or yeah, mainly they were starting to say lies about how the protest origin and who were the protesters. They said that they were mainly violent people who wanted to create chaos, etc., etc. So there was this counter discourse from some people from the internet who knew that, of course, the protests didn't originated there, but was something spontaneous from the people who went there to the protest, and they start to respond to these journalists. For example, here, top right. We could say that that's a way of intervention or on post, but there was also a way of soft hacking and spam, soft hacking through denouncing some accounts who spread this false information, or also spam using the hashtags. For example, here, again, the one of the journalists, or the other one, this one is other example, but from K-pop. That was a very interesting alliance in those months between the otaku community and the K-popers. I would say that it was more notorious, the participation of the otaku community, because, again, it's a generational thing. Most of the people who participated with this soft hacking and in social media, protesting virtually, yeah, they were otakus from maybe 18 up, the generation who like K-pop, since it's more recently, so it makes sense that the political participation would be less than the other one. But yeah, the other one that we can see, well, the other type of participation, for example, using cosplay, that imagine elements, clothes of anime and manga that we will see later, and I'm going to explain later, but also with placards here with images of anime and manga. But also it was very interesting, the emergence of these pronouncements of this group called the Peruvian Otaku Front. Here we have an example. In total, the Peruvian Otaku Front had 4 pronouncements. I'm going to read the first one. So the first one, just to see the language they used. Manga anime has taught us when the collective spirit is one, it can make the impossible possible. As an otaku community or manga anime fans, we are aware of the need to exercise our citizenship. Because of this, we believe that we can join our power and put it towards a better world. In this context of political, economic, and health crisis and coup d'etat, we are outraged by corruption and do not recognize the present regime as legitimate. Therefore, we consider it necessary to resist, and we cannot continue to go backwards as a country. In this otaku front, union is the way. As fans and citizens, we believe that our sphere of action is both the street and the digital space. This will be a platform where our struggle, reflection, and debate will be made visible. So this was the first pronouncement from November 13, 2020. And the second pronouncement, more than reading it, so it's very interesting, these pronouncements, because they use common topics in anime and manga and common language in anime and manga. For example, again, these phrases: collective spirit, join the power, to resist and make an union. So that's a very common language from, for example, the shonen anime, the shonen genre, this type of anime genre aimed to males, for a male audience, where their protagonists have to join, or the main character have to join in a team and go through many difficulties, and then they will succeed. But they succeed because they join forces and have this type of collective spirit. So yeah, there is this use of language of anime and manga through all their pronouncements. Sometimes they are more explicit about the references. For example, I think in the third one, they are, no, in the fourth one, they are referencing exactly names of some animes. Also, it's very interesting, and here we start to see how there's an intersection with LGBT communities, because they start to use inclusive language. Something that was very polemic and very criticized during 2020, during the pandemic, about what's the necessity of using an inclusive language. And also, other characteristic here is how they, through using many references to the language of anime and manga, they try to start this conversation about how also anime and manga could help their audience to build this notion of citizenship, and how also this context of crisis make us think more about this problematic on what happened with citizenship, why there is this crisis in this moment, who are the people who are more perjudicated about this situation. So yeah, that's one of the ways of activism that we saw on the pronouncements here, and the other one in the streets. So we saw lots of people during the protest using anime manga imaginary through clothes, for example. They made a reappropriation of many elements, not only language, but also, for example, and it was very interesting how they use some clothes from animes that were in some moment criticized by their militarization, for example, Shingeki no Kyojin, or also a reference to anarchist group, and well, to violent groups, to use other term, violent groups, such as the characters in Naruto, specifically the faction of Pain, that was one specific arc of the anime. So even though they use these images that could be, for the people who consume this anime, could be like very polemic, at the end they reappropriate it and just use it to manifest their dissatisfaction to the system, and to say, we are already here. If we have to put our body against the police, okay, we are going to do it. It was a risk they were willing to take, because it was something very probable that would happen during those days, that if you are in the protest, maybe you have to run, you have to receive gas. It's a possibility to fight the police. Maybe not in the front line like the fans of football, the skaters, and other people, but still they were willing to give their bodies in this protest to manifest their dissatisfaction. Also, this use of elements from anime and manga, they usually, we see how they use them in specific contexts. For example, anime conventions, or in some specific markets where they sell anime and mangas, such as the Centro Comercial Arenales. But to see these elements in a protest, it's to blurry the frontiers between these spaces where it's allowed to use this type of clothes and type of cosplay, we could say, and in a political, in the real world, real situation. So this was very a way of destabilize the system and destabilize our notions of reality. And I think that that was also what got the attention from the press. And what is also very revolutionary, because they were using the fantasy to express their political dissatisfaction. But as we also know, most of the revolutionary movements that emerge are also reabsorbed by the capital and the system and politics. And that's what we saw briefly, shortly after the protest against Manuel Merino. It was fastly reassimilated to the system. We saw two examples there, Jorge Hugo Romero from the Partido Popular Cristiano and Milagros Juárez from Unión por el Perú. And the case of Milagros Juárez was very paradoxical because she was a candidate. She was known as the Candidato Otaku. And it was very paradoxical because the party she was participated was very well known for being anti-globalization and ultranationalist. And how could you be a candidato otaku, a product that comes from these dynamics of exchange and globalization? And how could you be that in that kind of political party? That was very paradoxical, but well, capital and politics do many interesting things when they want to absorb and reabsorb revolutionary movements or revolution in general. So after the protest, we saw that many of the people who protest leave political action and continue with their lives. Maybe some of them believe in this type of candidates, I don't know. But that's the moment when I start to think about, okay, maybe we have to get our attention and study, we have to study them, this type of political movement, but also we have to see and we have to study maybe those bodies who are not easily reassimilated to the system and that could vote for this type of candidates. What happens if we start to look for queer bodies, the LGBT communities, and how these, and specifically analyze the people who are part of the LGBT communities who consider themselves activists and also who consider themselves otaku. So this intersection of the three, how they join together in this image of the Artivist. In some of the products that I saw in fanzine with intersection of anime and manga, I saw that there was a queer potential, or the authors that I interview and I work sometimes, that are Gia Lujuria, Estado de Limbo, and Glad Demon. They see a queer potential in anime and manga. And I also think that we have to think about the queer affects that can emerge through the gaze and the touch when, for example, we read a manga, a queer manga, an LGBT manga, yaoi and yuri, or when we touch and interact with an LGBT fanzine. So we see there a kind of queer affect that can emerge, but also anime and manga have this queer potential because it depicts this type of topics. Also, per se, anime and manga has very queer potential because it's very liminal. For example, some anime genres like the shoujo depicts characters with Japanese problems and topics, but with European bodies and settings. But in the context of Latin America, they have Argentinian or Mexican dub. So when we consume in Latin America this type of products, there is a product that we can't like put in the box easily. Yes, yeah, they are Japanese products, but they have all these complexities around. Also, there is very interesting because most of these works shows depicts the body in a very plastic way. Not only because that's very easy with if we are talking about cartoons or drawing, the representation via drawing of a body that allows the person to depict it in a very plastic way or to play with the body. But also that's very common in some products in anime and manga. And also we can make a connection there with some of the concepts of, for example, the Lucy Watari and the concept of becoming, how easily the body can connect with other things, or how easily the body can be plastic. And then, yeah, the only problem that I found in these products is that yeah, they make commentaries around how the nation is built, how the conceptions of body, sexuality are conceived. But even though they use an anime and manga imaginary, they don't necessarily think about the problems of Orientalism. And that's one thing that I'm still thinking about. What do they do with this Orientalism that we were talking about in all this panel, and how they perpetuate or not this concept of the Asian bodies as a plague. I still don't know. I also don't think that this product have to solve anything, but yeah, it just got my attention how they reappropriate this type of products, but not necessarily think about other problematics such as Orientalism. And just to see a case here, Exploradores de la Luna, that is what I was talking about, how it questions some notions such, for example, the construction of Peruvian history, who is part of the archive or not, or the history or not. And of course, trans bodies are not considered in the Peruvian construction of the Peruvian history and nation. And that's one thing that Gia Lujuria started to think about. That was her main goal at writing these texts, because it is a compilation of the life of some trans and gay activists from, well, mainly that from the 2000 onwards, but of course, some of the activists born before. So yeah, if we see some of the people who are depicted in this book, even their presence their presence in internet is, we don't see much of them, not even in the internet. That is other way of building an archive. And even though if these bodies were in the internet, it's a very ephemeral archive. So that's why this effort of Gia Lujuria of putting them in print, in a physical context, even though it is in this low circulation type of material that is the fanzine. And also it has some images in the style of anime and manga did by Estado de Limbo. If we see here at the bottom left, there's one example of the graphics inside of Exploradoras de la Luna. And also from here is that I take these reflections about how cosplay in general and otaku culture can have transgressive potential. mainly from the performances and how the use of anime, manga, imaginary can blurry the frontiers between reality and fiction, political action and fiction, and also how cosplay can be can be compared with drag in some contexts. And yeah, that's my presentation. It doesn't solve anything. It just lots of questions that are still open and some things to think about. For example, yeah, what happened with the concept of the multitude? Of course, people have the potency, but still is how if the potency of and the agency of the people is enough for evolve and do political action or not, because only having agency doesn't destructure the system and doesn't change the capitalist system. And the other problematic that I saw is the one that I was saying minutes before, the problem of Orientalism in these products, what happened with the bodies here. But yeah, that's all for me from today. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing.